My name is Alan Thompson, and for 79 years I have carried with me memories that no human being should have. I served in the 45th Infantry Battalion of the United States Army during the Second World War. Today, at the age of 98, I can still feel the weight of that day on April 29, 1945, when our unit was one of the first to arrive at the Dachau concentration camp. We were young, most of us just over 20 years old, full of ideals about heroism and glory. We had faced intense fighting across Europe, but nothing could have prepared us for what we would find there. The smell was the first thing we noticed kilometers before we saw the gates. It was a smell that penetrated not only the nostrils, but the very soul. Our unit had received orders to advance towards a compound near Munich. That morning, Sergeant Miller assembled our platoon and informed us of reports of a possible prison camp. "Thompson," he called out to me, "you and your team take the east side." I commanded a group of 5 men: Rodriguez, Klein, Morrison, Parker, and Wilson. As we got closer, we saw the watchtowers and the electrified fences. A train was stopped on the tracks leading to the camp, and we discovered that it was full of bodies. Hundreds of them. People who had died during transportation, abandoned as disposable cargo. The silence was deafening. Normally, in combat operations, there is the constant sound of gunfire, explosions, orders being shouted. Here it was different. It was as if the very air was heavy with the horror of what was about to be revealed. When we reached the main gates, some SS guards tried to resist. It was a brief but intense battle. Rodriguez, who was next to me, was shot in the shoulder, but the adrenaline was so high that he kept going, determined to complete our mission. The first prisoner we encountered could barely stand. He was a man who must have been my age at the time, but he looked 80. His eyes, those eyes haunt my dreams to this day, empty of hope, but still shining with a spark of life when he saw us coming. "Americaner," he whispered, trembling. When I nodded in confirmation, tears began to stream down his scrawny face. He tried to smile, but his cracked lips could barely move. The tents, my God, the stalls, they were like warehouses of death. People huddled together, so thin they looked like walking corpses. Some didn't even have the strength to lift their heads when we entered. Others clung to our legs, begging for help in dozens of different languages. Klein, who spoke German, began to translate some stories. Every word was like a stab. Entire families exterminated, inhumane medical experiments, forced labor to death. Human cruelty had reached levels I had never imagined possible. Wilson, our field doctor, immediately began organizing a makeshift aid station. "Thompson," he called to me urgently, "we need more medical supplies. A lot more." His voice was raspy, something that had never happened in all our months of combat together. The rest of the battalion arrived in the next few minutes. I saw veteran soldiers, men who had faced the worst battles without hesitation, falling to their knees in front of that scene. Some were vomiting, others weeping openly. Morrison, a tough guy from Brooklyn who never showed emotion, sat on the ground and remained silent for hours. We immediately began the work of documentation. We photographed everything, cataloged evidence. It was crucial that the world knew that no one could deny what had happened there. Parker, who was carrying a camera, took pictures with trembling hands. "So that they never forget," he repeated like a mantra. As the day progressed, more horrors were uncovered. Piles of personal belongings, glasses, shoes, suitcases with names carefully written on them by people who would never claim them again. Each object told a story of a life interrupted, of dreams destroyed, of humanity stolen. Night came, but no one could sleep. We stayed up, distributing rations, water, and blankets. We had to be careful with the food. Wilson warned us that giving too much food at once could kill these fragile people. That was just the first day of many that we would spend in Dachau. But it was the day that changed our understanding of what it means to be human in both the best and worst possible sense. We discovered that liberation was only the beginning of a much longer journey of trying to understand how something like this could happen, and more importantly, how to prevent it from happening again. That first night in Dachau, none of us could sleep. The silence was occasionally broken by the faint moans of the survivors and the restrained crying of my companions. Rodriguez, even with an injured shoulder, insisted on helping to distribute medical supplies. "I can't rest while these people need help," he said with determination in his eyes. The next morning, we began to better organize our rescue operation. Wilson set up a makeshift infirmary in one of the abandoned administrative buildings. Klein, our interpreter, worked tirelessly, translating stories that would make the toughest man cry. We discovered that many prisoners were doctors, teachers, artists, ordinary people whose only crime was being who they were. One particular moment remains etched in my memory. A girl, no more than 16, approached me carrying something wrapped in a piece of dirty cloth. "First see," she said, holding out the package with trembling hands. It was a small diary, in which she had documented her journey since arriving in the camp. Klein translated a few pages, and every word was like a dagger in our hearts. Parker continued his work of photographic documentation, but I noticed that his hands were shaking more and more as he photographed the piles of bodies. The gas chambers disguised the showers, the still warm crematoria. "I need to record everything," he kept repeating, so that no one could deny it later. Morrison, who had finally come out of his initial state of shock, organized a group to catalog the personal belongings found. Thousands of wedding rings, watches, glasses, children's shoes. Each object told a silent story of lives brutally interrupted. Our anger grew with each new discovery. We found documents detailing gruesome medical experiments, meticulous records of mass executions, lists of names that filled pages and pages. The systematic organization of the horror was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of it all. Sergeant Miller gathered our unit together to discuss how to deal with the SS guards we had captured. Some of my comrades wanted immediate justice, driven by fury at what we had witnessed. Others, including me, argued that we should keep them alive to face a war tribunal. The tension was palpable. One of the most surreal moments was when we found the camp's medicine warehouse. It was full of medicines and medical supplies that could have saved hundreds of lives, but were deliberately withheld from the prisoners. Wilson had to stop himself from punching the wall when he saw it. The stories that the survivors began to share with us were heartbreaking. One elderly woman told me how she had been separated from her 3 daughters on arrival at the camp. "I never saw them again," she said in German, while Klein translated in a broken voice. "But now I know I can die in peace, because he came." The work of cleaning and organizing continued for days. Each new morning brought with it new challenges and horrifying discoveries. We had to deal not only with the physical rescue of the survivors, but also with the emotional weight of being witnesses to such barbarity. Rodriguez, even though wounded, became a kind of symbol of hope for many survivors. His determination to continue helping, despite the pain, inspired both the prisoners and our own unit. "If they survive this," he would say, "the least I can do is ignore a bruise on my shoulder." As the days passed, we began to see small signs of life returning to the survivors' eyes. Some children even rehearsed shy smiles. It was as if humanity itself was struggling to rise from the ashes of that place of death. But for every moment of hope, there was another of deep sadness. Many survivors, despite our best efforts, did not survive. Their bodies, already very weak, simply gave up. Each death was like a personal defeat for all of us. Wilson began keeping a diary of his own, documenting medical procedures and patients' conditions, so that medicine would never again be used to cause so much harm, he explained, his words laden with a mixture of pain and determination. As the days passed in Dachau, the line between saviors and avengers began to blur. I noticed subtle changes in my companions, Morrison's distant gaze as we found yet another mass grave, the way Parker's hands trembled more and more as he photographed the evidence, Klein's growing silence after each new translated story. One morning, we found a group of children hiding in one of the deposits. They were so scared that they cringed when we tried to approach them. Wilson knelt down, offering pieces of chocolate that he kept in his medical kit. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, looked at the candy as if it were something alien. "She's probably never seen chocolate in her life," Rodriguez whispered, his voice breaking. The documentation work continued. Each new report we prepared revealed a deeper layer of horror. We discovered meticulous records of medical experiments that made our stomachs lurch. Parker had to stop several times while photographing these documents, unable to hold back tears of rage. One of the most striking moments was when a survivor, a history teacher from Prague, handed me a secret notebook he had kept for the world to know, he said in broken German. In it, there were detailed drawings of the camp, lists of names, dates of executions, all recorded with painful precision. The tension between our unit and the captured SS guards increased daily. Some of my men wanted to take justice into their own hands. They don't deserve a trial, argued Morrison one evening. I had to remind him that we were different from them precisely because we respected the law and justice. Wilson established a triage system in the makeshift infirmary, prioritizing the most serious cases. Every life we save is a victory against them, he would say, working tirelessly. But for every survivor we managed to help, others collapsed, their bodies too weak to recover. One afternoon, Rodriguez found a violin among the confiscated belongings. One of the prisoners, a musician from Vienna, asked to play it. The sound that emerged from the strings was heartbreaking, a melody that spoke of pain, but also of hope. For a few minutes, the whole camp stopped to listen. Klein began to compile a record of the stories he was translating. Someone needs to tell it properly, he explained, writing late at night by candlelight. His notes revealed not only the horror of the camp, but also small acts of resistance and humanity that survived even the worst circumstances. Sergeant Miller organized daily meetings to discuss the progress of our mission and maintain troop morale. It was a delicate balance. We needed to keep our sanity while dealing with the unimaginable. Remember who we are and why we're here, he kept repeating. News of what we had found in Dachau began to spread. Journalists and high-ranking officials began to arrive. Everyone reacted differently to the horror. Some wept openly, others stood in shocked silence. Parker continued his photographic work, now with even more determination. The world needs to see this, he insisted. At night, when we tried to rest, the nightmares came. I could hear my companions tossing and turning in their sleeping bags, some mumbling in their sleep. Wilson started distributing tranquilizers not only to the survivors but also to our own unit. The most noticeable transformation was in the survivors themselves. Those who managed to recover began to show signs of their humanity returning. An elderly woman started telling stories to the children. A man organized a small choir. It was like seeing flowers growing in a field of ash. But the shadow of Dachau was long and dark. Each new day brought with it the weight of what we had witnessed. We were young soldiers who had gone to war expecting to find glory and adventure. Instead, we encountered something that would forever change our understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The days in Dachau turned into weeks, and each moment brought new revelations about the depth of human cruelty. I noticed that some of my companions were beginning to show signs of the weight we were carrying. Wilson, always so professional, now spent hours in silence after his shifts on the ward. Rodriguez developed a nervous tic in his left eye, especially when we found more evidence of atrocities. One morning, during our usual rounds, we found a cache of documents that the Nazis hadn't had time to destroy. Klein spent hours translating, his face growing paler with each page. Thompson, he called out to me in a trembling voice, these aren't just death records. These are detailed instructions to break people, to destroy their souls before their bodies. Parker had stopped sleeping. He spent his nights developing photographs in a makeshift laboratory he had set up in one of the administrative rooms. I have to make sure that every image is perfect, he repeated, his dark circles getting deeper and deeper. We can't let anyone question what happened here. The survivors who were able to communicate began to share more of their stories with us. A young Polish woman told me how she had survived by pretending to be dead among corpses during a selection. She remained motionless for hours, feeling the cold of the bodies around her, until she managed to escape in the darkness. Her words haunt me to this day. Morrison, who initially wanted immediate revenge on the guards, now spent a lot of time with the surviving children. He organized little games, taught them words in English, tried to bring some normality to their shattered lives. They need to remember what it's like to be a child, he would say, his voice laden with a deep sadness. Sergeant Miller began to organize regular sessions where we could talk about what we were experiencing. We can't let it destroy us, he insisted. We need to keep our humanity, even in the face of the worst of humanity. But it was difficult. Each new day brought discoveries that tested our sanity. Wilson began to document the psychological effects he observed, both in the survivors and in our unit. It's as if there were two wars going on, he reflected. One that ended when we got here, and another that continues inside each one of us. One of the most surreal moments was when we found a room full of confiscated musical instruments. Rodriguez, despite his shoulder still recovering, helped organize a small orchestra with the survivors who knew how to play. The music that emerged from that place of death was like an act of final resistance against barbarism. Klein discovered that many of the prisoners were renowned intellectuals, artists, and scientists in their own countries. They tried to destroy not just people, he noted, but an entire cultural legacy. We began to record their stories, their contributions, determined to preserve what the Nazis had tried to erase. The documentation work continued unabated. Parker developed a meticulous system to catalog every piece of evidence, every testimony. When people in the future ask if this really happened, he said, "We'll have irrefutable proofs." The nights were the worst. The silence amplified our thoughts, our doubts about human nature. Morrison once confided in me. "Do you know what's most frightening, Thompson? It said it was normal people who did it. People with families, with ordinary lives." Rodriguez began writing letters home, trying to explain the inexplicable. "How do you tell something like that?" he asked me one night. "How do you make someone who hasn't been here understand?" Wilson established a strict protocol for documenting the survivors' medical conditions. "It's not just about treating the physical injuries," he explained. "It's about understanding how the human body can endure so much horror and still find the strength to go on." As more units arrived to help, our responsibility changed. We were no longer just liberators. We were witnesses, guardians of a truth that the world needed to know. A truth that, even decades later, still weighs on my conscience as if it were yesterday. The weeks in Dachau had changed us in ways we could never have imagined. Each of us carried the weight of that place differently. Parker had completely stopped talking, communicating only through gestures and glances, while his hands continued the meticulous work of photographic documentation. Wilson developed an obsessive ritual of washing his hands repeatedly after each medical procedure, as if trying to clean not only the physical dirt, but also the invisible stains that place left on our souls. One morning, we were visited by high-ranking officers and representatives of the international press. It was our responsibility to guide them around the camp, to show them the evidence we had collected. Klein, who had become our unofficial spokesperson due to his fluency in several languages, led the group with admirable composure, although I could see his hand shaking as he pointed to the gas chambers. Rodriguez, still recovering from a shoulder injury, had established a special connection with a group of young survivors. He taught them to play baseball using makeshift equipment, and the sound of their occasional laughter was like a balm in the midst of the horror. "They need to remember what it's like to be young," he told me one afternoon, his watery eyes watching the children play. Morrison devoted himself to organizing the victims' records, working tirelessly to give names and dignity to those who had been reduced to numbers. "Every name we identify," he explained, "is a person returned to history, a family that can finally know what happened to their loved one." A particularly disturbing discovery came when we found a set of diaries kept by one of the camp doctors. Wilson spent hours translating the notes with Klein, documenting the experiments carried out. After finishing, our unit doctor left in silence and didn't return for 2 days. When he returned, his eyes carried a new kind of determination. Sergeant Miller established a system of rotation between the teams, recognizing that no one could endure that work continuously without breaking down. "Stay human," he reminded us during the evening meetings. That's what set us apart from them. One of the survivors, a rabbi who had lost his entire family, began performing small ceremonies for the dead. Even those of us who didn't share his faith took part. feeling a deep need to honor those who didn't survive. His voice, chanting ancient prayers in Hebrew, echoed through the corridors of the camp like a lament for all humanity. Parker finally completed his photographic archive, thousands of images documenting every aspect of the horror we encountered. So that no one can deny it, he whispered, the first words he had uttered in days, as he handed me a copy of the negatives to keep. The SS guards we had in custody began to talk. Some tried to negotiate clemency in exchange for information. Klein translated their statements, each word revealing new levels of systematized cruelty. Morrison had to be restrained when one of the guards tried to justify his actions as just following orders. Wilson started a more structured rehabilitation program for the survivors, working with doctors who arrived from other units. It's not just the body that needs to heal, he observed, noticing how many prisoners still cringe at the sight of uniforms, even ours. At night, when silence fell over the camp, each of us faced our own demons. Rodriguez wrote endless letters to his family in Chicago, trying to explain the inexplicable. Klein translated the prisoners' diaries until he fell asleep over the papers. In me, I watched the stars and wondered how the same sky could have witnessed such barbarity without intervening. The journalists who visited us often asked how we managed to continue our work day after day. The answer lay in the eyes of the survivors, in the way they were slowly beginning to regain their humanity. Every little sign of hope, a shy smile, a softly hummed psalm, a whispered prayer, was a victory against the evil that had reigned in that place. 79 years have passed since those days in Dachau, but the memories remain as vivid as the moment I lived them. The weight of those weeks shaped not only my life, but that of all my comrades who survived to tell this story. Wilson never practiced medicine again after the war. I can't look at a white coat without seeing those SS doctors, he confided to me years later at one of our annual meetings. He dedicated his life to documenting Nazi medical crimes, ensuring that future generations of health professionals understood the ethical implications of their profession. Parker continued photographing until his death in 1989. His images of Dachau have become a fundamental part of the Holocaust archives. Each photograph he took carried not only the visual evidence of the horror, but also his own transformation from young soldier to witness to history. Rodriguez, with a shoulder that never fully recovered, established a relief program for refugee children in Chicago. Those children in Dachau taught me that hope survives even in the darkest places, he used to say. He kept in touch with some of the young survivors until the end of his life. Klein became a translator of the United Nations and actively participated in the Nuremberg trials. His experience at Dachau made him particularly valuable, as he could translate not only the words, but also the weight of the horror they carried. Some things can't be translated literally, he once explained to me. You need to translate the soul behind the words. Morrison never fully got over what we saw. He isolated himself in a small town in the countryside, rarely talking about the war. But every year, on the anniversary of the liberation of Dachau, he sent letters to each of us. Lest we forget, he wrote, always using the same phrase that became our involuntary mantra. Sergeant Miller dedicated the rest of his life to educating young people about the Holocaust. He visited schools, universities, sharing our story with a new generation. The greatest danger, he always warned, is to think that it can't happen again. As for me, I've spent decades trying to understand how to process everything we've witnessed. Every dream, every memory carries fragments of those days. The smell still haunts me, the deafening silence of the piles of personal belongings, the empty stares that gradually regained their humanity. I've kept in touch with some of the survivors over the years. Seeing their lives rebuilt, their families growing, was like a small victory against the evil we encountered at Dachau. One lady, whom I knew as a scrawny young woman in those dark days, now has grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You didn't just liberate us, she told me at our last meeting. You gave us back our humanity. The documents we collected, Parker's photographs, Wilson's medical records, Klein's translations. All this material continues to educate new generations about the horrors of the Holocaust. It is a testament not only to human cruelty, but also to the vital importance of memory and truth. In my 98 years, I still wonder how human beings could do that to other human beings. The answer, I realize, lies not in some extraordinary evil, but in the banality of evil, in the way ordinary people can be driven to commit atrocities when they lose their moral compass. The legacy of Dachau is not just a horror story. It is a warning, a constant reminder of the importance of vigilance against hatred and intolerance. Each new conflict, each new manifestation of prejudice and discrimination brings back those memories and reinforces the importance of telling that story. Today, as I share these memories, I think of my departed comrades, of Rodriguez and his generous heart, of Parker and his quiet determination, of Wilson and his tireless dedication, of Klein and his ability to translate not just words, but the very soul of humanity. Our mission at Dachau did not end with the liberation of the camp. It continues through the generations in the responsibility to keep alive the memory of what happened there. Because as long as there is someone to tell that story, as long as there are people willing to listen and learn, there is hope that such horrors will never be repeated. And so, at the age of 98, I continue to tell our story, not by choice, but by necessity, because the real horror lies not only in what happened at Dachau, but in the possibility that all of that could be forgotten, or worse still, denied. We are the last guardians of that memory, and our duty is to ensure that it survives beyond us. As Parker always said, so that they never forget, these words echo down the decades, carrying with them not only the memory of horror, but also the promise that, through knowledge and remembrance, we can build a better world.